The savannah doesn't forget. It holds on to stories like dust particles suspended in the heat, refusing to settle, refusing to let the past fade into silence. And the story of Kasai is one that the African wilderness will never forget. A lion so mighty, so legendary, that when he vanished into the shadows 14 months ago, everyone assumed he was dead. The rangers who had tracked him for years, the guides who whispered his name to tourists, the lionesses who had borne his cubs, they all believed the same thing. Kasai was gone. But in June 2019, something impossible happened. A massive shadow emerged from the northern territories, carrying a mane so dark it looked like midnight itself had taken physical form. His body was scarred beyond recognition, his left eye clouded white, his walk transformed into something almost unrecognizable. Yet somehow, inexplicably, the prides knew. The very earth seemed to tremble with the knowledge. Kasai had returned, and he was not the same. Before we reveal what happened during those missing 14 months, before we uncover the transformation that made him unrecognizable, you need to understand who Kasai was. You need to feel the weight of his legend. Because this isn't just a story about a lion who survived. This is a story about what survival costs. This is a story about a creature who was broken, shattered into pieces by the cruelty of the wild, and yet somehow found the strength to rebuild himself into something darker, something more dangerous, something that would reshape the very fabric of his territory forever. If you love extraordinary real-life stories from the animal kingdom that will shock you, that will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about nature's capacity for resilience and transformation, then hit that subscribe button right now and turn on your notifications, because what comes next will haunt you long after you finish watching. The year was 2017 when Kasai first emerged as a force to be reckoned with. He wasn't born a legend. No lion is. Instead, he was made through blood, through suffering, through 1,000 small moments of brutality that accumulated into a creature of pure dominance. At that time, he was just a young male, barely 5 years old, still carrying the softness of youth in his features, but his eyes already held something darker, something that promised violence, something that whispered of a future written in conquest and fear. His pride, known to the rangers as the Kamusi Pride, controlled a vast stretch of territory in the northern reaches of the delta. It was prime land, blessed with permanent water sources and abundant prey. Buffalo herds migrated through twice yearly. Zebras crossed the grasslands in numbers that seemed infinite. Impalas scattered like leaves whenever a predator approached. For a lion, this was paradise. For Kasai, it was the beginning of an empire. The dominant male at that time was an aging king called Makosi. He had ruled for almost 8 years, an eternity in lion politics. His mane was gray-streaked and worn. His body carried the accumulated damage of countless battles. He was still formidable, still dangerous, but everyone could see the decline. It was written in the slight hesitation before he charged, in the way he favored his right front leg after heavy hunts, in the haunted quality that sometimes flickered through his amber eyes, the look of a ruler who knew his time was ending. Kasai challenged him in the dry season of 2017. The clash happened near the Salt Licks, in front of nearly a dozen lionesses and their cubs. It was brutal in ways that left even the most experienced rangers stunned. Makosi fought with the desperation of a king refusing to surrender his throne. But Kasai was younger, faster, hungrier. He moved with a precision that suggested he had been planning this moment his entire life. The fight lasted almost 20 minutes. By the end, Makosi lay broken near a rocky outcrop, barely breathing. Kasai stood over him, his mane already beginning to darken with power and blood, and released a roar that echoed across the delta and seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. Makosi died 3 days later from infections that developed in his wounds. The rangers found his body decomposed beyond recognition, already claimed by the endless cycle of scavengers that turns death into life on the African savanna. His reign was over. The age of Kasai had begun. For 2 years, from 2017 to early 2019, Kasai ruled with an iron paw. He was extraordinary, the kind of lion that researchers dream about studying because he represents something rare, a perfect specimen of dominance and intelligence combined. He was large, nearly 480 pounds of pure muscle, but what truly set him apart was his mind. He understood strategy, he understood territory, he understood the psychology of the creatures around him in a way that most lions never grasp. Under his rule, the Kamusi Pride thrived. The The lionesses respected him, not out of affection, but out of a primal recognition that this male would keep them alive. He hunted with them, guided them, protected their cubs as though they were his own blood, which of course many of them were. Rangers documented him teaching young males the finer points of bringing down dangerous prey. They recorded him standing sentinel at night, his massive form silhouetted against the stars, watching the borders of his territory with an intensity that bordered on obsessive. He sired at least 23 cubs during those 2 years. His genetics were spreading through the delta like wildfire, creating a new generation of lions that carried his blood, his intelligence, his capacity for dominance. The future of the territory seemed assured. Kasai's lineage would rule for generations. At least that's what everyone believed. But the wild has a way of shattering certainty. The wild breaks plans, destroys dynasties, and erases the mightiest of kings as if they were nothing more than dust. And in March 2019, everything changed. The Rangers never found out exactly what happened. Some suggested a territorial dispute with a coalition of invading males. Others whispered about poachers with rifles and a hunger for lion hides that would bring them a fortune on the black market. Still others speculated about disease, about a fever that had swept through the territory and claimed the mighty Kasai as its victim. What they knew was this: Cassidy disappeared. One day he was there, claiming kills, siring cubs, maintaining his empire. The next day he was gone. The other males of his coalition searched for him. The lionesses called into the darkness with roars that carried desperation. The Rangers organized search parties, driving through the territory in their vehicles, calling his name, hoping against hope that he would emerge from the bush as he always had before. But Kasai did not emerge. Days turned into weeks, weeks turned into months. By the end of March, the conclusion seemed inevitable. Kasai was dead, the great king had fallen, and the Kamusi pride would need to reorganize under a new order. The Rangers filed their reports. The guides updated their stories. Tourists who came hoping to see the legendary Kasai were told, with somber voices and bowed heads, that he was gone. But the savannah had other plans. The savannah had not finished with Kasai. And 14 months later, in a moment that would be etched into the memory of everyone who witnessed it, he returned. But he was not the Kasai they remembered. June 18, 2019. The dry season had settled over the delta with an intensity that made even the hardened rangers sweat through their shirts by mid-morning. Water was scarce. Prey was scattered. The balance of nature had tilted towards suffering, and every creature in the territory understood that survival would demand everything they had. It was on this morning, as the sun climbed toward its zenith, that Ranger David Motsweldy was conducting a routine patrol near the Vumbi waterhole, almost 40 kilometers from the heart of the Kamusi territory. He almost didn't recognize what he was seeing. The figure that emerged from the northern bush was moving slowly, deliberately, with a gait that seemed almost painful. David's first thought was that this was a lion in distress, perhaps sick, perhaps injured, possibly dangerous in the unpredictable way that wounded animals become. He radioed his team to stay back, to maintain distance, to be prepared for anything. The vehicle slowed. David raised his binoculars to his eyes, and in that moment, everything changed. The mane was dark, almost black, a color David had never seen on any lion before. It was thick, matted with what looked like old blood and dust, spreading across the creature's shoulders like the armor of some ancient warrior. The body beneath was scarred in ways that defied comprehension. 3 deep parallel lines ran down the left side of the face, the kind of scarring that could only come from lion claws at devastating force. One ear was torn almost completely away, hanging by a thread of flesh, but it was the eyes that made David's breath catch in his throat. The left eye was completely white, clouded over with cataracts or scar tissue or some combination of both. The right eye was amber, piercing, unmistakably intelligent, and unmistakably familiar. Kasai, David whispered, just one word, just the name, but his hands were shaking as he reached for the radio. It's him, he said, his voice barely steady. It's Kasai. He's alive, and I don't know what he is anymore. The news spread through the reserve like wildfire. Within hours, every ranger knew. The guides who worked with tourists received calls. The research team dropped everything. By evening, word had reached the main office, and by the next morning, Dr. Sarah Chen, the lead wildlife behaviorist for the research station, was examining Kasai from a distance of approximately 200 meters, her hands trembling as she took notes. "I've been studying lion behavior for 24 years, she would later write in her field journal. "I have never seen anything like this. This lion has endured something catastrophic, something that should have killed him, something that apparently tried to kill him, and yet here he stands, alive, transformed, unrecognizable." Over the following weeks, as rangers observed Kasai from safe distances, a picture began to emerge of what those 14 months away had done to him. The scars told stories. The damage spoke of suffering on a scale that was almost incomprehensible. The left side of his face, the side most severely scarred, suggested repeated trauma. Not a single catastrophic injury, but multiple incidents, multiple attacks, multiple moments when death had come close enough to mark him permanently. The claw marks on his face were consistent with lion claws. This was the crucial detail. Kasai had been fighting lions. Not one lion in a single battle, but multiple lions, likely multiple times over an extended period. The pattern of scarring suggested he had been attacked, had survived, had been attacked again, had survived again. It was as if he had been trapped in some kind of nightmare scenario where escape was possible, but only through enduring unimaginable punishment. His left eye was completely blind. The permanent cloudiness, and the way he compensated for it, turning his head slightly to ensure his right eye tracked movement, suggested catastrophic damage to the eye itself, or perhaps the optic nerve. Losing sight in one eye was a devastating injury for any predator, but Kasai had adapted. He had learned to move differently, to position himself differently, to hunt differently. The adaptation was visible in his body language, in the way he held himself, in the almost mechanical precision of his movements. But the most shocking transformation was not visible in his scars. It was visible in his behavior. Kasai was different in ways that went far deeper than physical appearance. The lion that had returned was darker, colder, more dangerous than the one who had disappeared. It was as if the 14 months of suffering had burned away everything soft, everything merciful, everything that could be considered compassionate or reasonable. What remained was pure, distilled predatory focus. Within 3 days of his reappearance, Kasai had killed 5 animals, not to eat, though he consumed portions of each kill, but as declarations of ownership. He marked territory with an intensity that suggested obsession. He roared at least 20 times per day, his voice louder, rawer, more aggressive than rangers remembered. The roar itself sounded different, scarred, as if his vocal cords had been damaged and never fully healed, creating a sound that was somehow more terrifying than the roar of an ordinary lion. Dr. Chen documented his hunting patterns with careful precision. Kasai has adopted hunting strategies that suggest he has been living in extreme isolation, she noted. His technique is more aggressive, less refined than it was before. He seems to rely more on brute force and less on the strategic coordination he displayed previously. This could indicate that he has been surviving as a solitary predator, competing with others, fighting constantly. His body language suggests trauma. His hunting style suggests desperation learned through survival, not instinct. The lionesses of the Kamusi pride recognized him. This was confirmed on the morning of June 25th, when Kasai approached the main pride near a waterhole, and the females did not flee. They did not attack. Instead, they exhibited submissive behavior mixed with something that looked almost like awe. They touched their faces to his scarred muzzle. They allowed him to feed on their kills. They seemed to understand that this was their king, changed beyond measure but still their king. What happened next would be documented, photographed and studied by wildlife researchers for years to come. Kasai didn't simply rejoin the pride, he reclaimed it. He reasserted dominance not through displays or challenges, but through sheer presence. 2 younger males who had begun to establish themselves during his absence challenged him within 48 hours. The battles were brief, brutal, and decisively one-sided. Both males were severely wounded and driven from the territory. One didn't survive. Rangers found his body 3 days later, infected wounds having turned septic. But the most remarkable transformation became apparent over the following weeks as Kasai's behavior pattern emerged. He was hunting with an intensity that exceeded anything documented in his previous reign. He was taking down prey that should have been too large, too dangerous, or too numerous for a single lion to handle. Just 4 days after his reappearance, rangers documented him bringing down a buffalo bull alone, a massive creature weighing nearly 900 kilograms. Kasai had attacked it alone, harassed it into exhaustion, and finally killed it despite the danger of the bull's horns, which could have impaled and killed him with a single wrong move. He's compensating, Dr. Chen theorized. The loss of vision in one eye has made him more reliant on other senses and more aggressive to compensate for the vulnerability. But there's something else. He's hunting like he's driven by something beyond hunger, like he's trying to prove something, to himself perhaps, or to the territory, or to whatever it was that took him away. The legend of Kasai began to transform. The rangers and guides stopped speaking of him as the mighty king who had ruled before. Instead, they spoke of him as something darker, something more dangerous. They called him the ghost, the shadow, the returned one. Tourists who had hoped to see the legendary lion were warned away from areas where he was known to be hunting. He was no longer considered safe to observe. He was unpredictable. His behavior patterns had become erratic. He seemed almost angry at the world, as though every living creature was responsible for whatever horror he had endured during those 14 months away. By mid-July, the physical evidence of his ordeal had begun to tell its story more clearly. Dr. Chen, working with a team of veterinary specialists, managed to tranquilize Kasai on July 14th, a dangerous operation that took 5 darts and required 3 backup vehicles and conducted a comprehensive physical examination. What they found was even more horrifying than the visible scars suggested. His left shoulder blade had been fractured and had healed badly, leaving him with slightly limited movement in that leg. 3 ribs on his left side showed evidence of old breaks. His spine carried marks consistent with being slammed repeatedly against hard ground. His teeth showed significant wear, particularly on the left side, suggesting he had been chewing something abrasive for extended periods. The veterinary team theorized he might have been trapped, locked in combat with something immovable, grinding his teeth against rock or dirt or bone in his attempts to escape. But the most devastating finding was internal. A massive scar in his liver suggested a previous penetrating wound that had missed his vital organs by centimeters. Scarring in his lungs suggested he had been wounded in the chest and had survived despite blood filling his respiratory system. Every organ they examined told a story of trauma, of near-death experiences, of a body that should have given up but instead had refused to accept defeat. When the tranquilizer wore off and Kasai woke, something strange happened. Dr. Chen was observing from a safe distance when the lion opened his eyes. For a moment there was confusion, the disorientation of anesthesia, then recognition. Kasai's eye fixed on the vehicle, on the humans inside, and something dark flickered across his features. He didn't attack, he didn't charge. Instead, he rose slowly, shook himself, and walked directly toward the reserve boundary, toward the northern territories where he had presumably spent those 14 months of agony. He knew, Chen wrote in her journal that night, he understood that we had done something to him, examined him, violated him in some way, and yet he didn't retaliate. There was intelligence in that restraint, but also something terrifying. It was as if he was deciding not to attack, as if he could have, but chose not to. That kind of restraint is almost more frightening than aggression. Over the following months, a pattern emerged. Kasai was not simply reclaiming his old territory. He was expanding it. He was pushing farther north, farther east, taking over lands that had belonged to other prides, other coalitions, other lions who thought they had safe territories. And he was doing it with a brutality that shocked even the rangers who had seen decades of lion politics. In August, he killed 3 young males from the neighboring Okavango pride in a single week. In September, he drove an entire pride of 6 females and their cubs from a waterhole simply by appearing on the ridge above them. In October, he fought a coalition of 2 adult males near the Tsaro marshlands and emerged victorious despite being significantly outnumbered. By November 2019, less than 6 months after his return, Kasai had effectively doubled the size of his territory. He controlled nearly 180 square kilometers of prime land, an empire that would have been remarkable for any lion, but was absolutely extraordinary considering his physical limitations and the trauma he had endured. He had gone from being the king to being something more, a conqueror, an empire builder, a force reshaping the political landscape of the entire region. But the question that haunted Dr. Chen and every researcher who studied him remained unanswered. Where had he been? What had happened during those 14 months? And what was the nature of the ordeal that had transformed him from a great king into something darker, something more dangerous, something that seemed almost driven by rage? The answers would come slowly, through careful observation, through piecing together tracks and scat samples, through studying his movement patterns and comparing them to known territories and reported incidents. And those answers would reveal a story so brutal, so extraordinary, that it would challenge everything scientists thought they understood about lion behavior and the capacity for survival in the face of unimaginable adversity. The breakthrough came in December 2019, almost 7 months after Kasai's mysterious return. A ranger named Thomas Mwangi, who had been tracking Kasai's movements obsessively since his reappearance, made a discovery that would finally begin to answer the question that had haunted everyone. Where had he been? Thomas was investigating a series of kills along the northern boundary of the reserve when he found something unusual. A lion skeleton, aged approximately 14 or 18 months old, based on bone density and deterioration patterns. The skeleton was missing its skull, suggesting scavengers had carried it away, but the vertebrae and ribs told a story of violence. Deep gouges marked several of the bones. Claw marks consistent with lion claws scarred the shoulder blades and ribs. This lion had been killed in combat, and killed brutally. But the most significant discovery was 2 kilometers away from the skeleton. Thomas found a series of paw prints pressed into dried mud near a small waterhole. Prints that matched Kasai's distinctive left front paw, which had a missing claw that had been torn away sometime in the distant past. The prints weren't fresh. The mud was ancient, cracked and hardened by months of sun and dry season heat. These prints were from months ago, possibly from the period when Kasai had disappeared. The prints led northward, away from the reserve, into territories that belonged to private hunting concessions and unprotected lands where the rules of conservation didn't apply. Thomas followed the trail as far as he could before it disappeared into rocky terrain that left no trace, but he had discovered the direction. Kasai had gone north, and based on the condition of the bones and the timeline, he had gone north while fleeing from something. Dr. Chen coordinated with conservation authorities in neighboring territories, sending inquiries to guides, rangers, and hunters who worked in the northern regions. The responses trickled in slowly, and gradually, a narrative began to emerge from the scattered reports and observations. It painted a picture of survival that seemed almost impossible. In March 2019, the same month Kasai disappeared from the reserve, reports had come from the hunting concessions approximately 60 kilometers north of the main reserve. A massive lion had been spotted in territories that were controlled by hunting operations. The guides at these operations had immediately launched tracking efforts. A lion this size, this distinctive, would be a trophy worth hundreds of thousands of dollars to wealthy hunters willing to pay for the experience. What followed was a hunt that lasted almost 3 weeks. The massive lion, which had to have been Kasai, based on description and timeline, was pursued relentlessly. The hunters used dogs. They tracked him across open grasslands. They drove him into terrain that was progressively more difficult and more dangerous. But the lion refused to fall. Reports from guides described a creature that seemed almost supernatural in its refusal to surrender, a beast that turned on its pursuers repeatedly, fought back with ferocity that cost hunters wounded dogs and terrified pursuit teams. One guide reported finding evidence of a confrontation where the lion had apparently fought with multiple hunting dogs simultaneously. Blood stained the earth. Fur, both lion and dog, was scattered across a quarter-kilometer area. 3 dogs were found dead, their bodies torn apart with violence that suggested a predator at the absolute edge of desperation and fury. The lion had survived, but clearly at a cost. The guide noted deep wounds across the lion's flanks, visible from a distance, suggesting that despite his power, the sustained pursuit had taken a toll. The hunters eventually gave up the pursuit in early April, realizing that this particular lion was more dangerous and more determined than any trophy was worth. The guides filed their reports and moved on to other opportunities. But Kasai, wounded and traumatized, was now far from his territory, far from his pride, and facing a landscape that was hostile in ways he had never experienced. What happened next, Dr. Chen would theorize months later, was a series of encounters with other lions whose territories he had invaded while fleeing. Kasai was no longer in his own domain, where he was the undisputed apex. He was in unfamiliar territories where other lions had established dominance, and he was wounded, which made him vulnerable in ways he had never been before. From scattered reports and observations pieced together from local guides and hunters, a grueling picture emerged. Kasai had spent months moving between territories, unable to return directly to his home because the hunting pressure had been too intense. He had engaged in multiple territorial battles with lions from other prides. He had been driven from waterholes. He had been forced to hunt in ways that were dangerous and inefficient because he couldn't access the prime hunting grounds. One guide reported a confrontation between what had to have been Kasai and a coalition of 3 males in a territory controlled by a different pride. The battle had been massive, visible from kilometers away, the roars echoing across the landscape for hours. When it was over, Kasai had limped away, but he had left behind evidence of the violence, blood trails, claw marks on trees, the body of one of the coalition males that had been killed and partially consumed. Another report described a lion of Kasai's size and description attacking hunters directly. The lion had apparently charged a hunting party that had gotten too close, wounded one of the trackers with a single swipe of its paw, and forced the entire group to flee. The incident had occurred in July 2019, suggesting that even as late as the middle of his ordeal, Kasai's aggression and desperation were only increasing. Throughout all of this, the hunting pressure, the territorial battles, the starvation and water scarcity, Kasai was slowly making his way south, gradually finding his path back toward familiar territories. Dr. Chen studied maps, tracking reports, and ranger observations to construct a timeline. The journey south would have taken months. Kasai would have needed to move carefully, avoiding areas of high hunting pressure, seeking water sources that existed in the dry season, hunting when he could despite his wounds. By late fall, approximately 7 months into his ordeal, Kasai had begun to approach the boundaries of the reserve, but he couldn't simply walk back in. Other lions had moved into his old territory. The Kamusi pride had reorganized under different leadership. Younger males had established themselves in areas he had once controlled. Returning home meant fighting for his territory again, meant proving his dominance despite his wounds and weakness. This was where the final phase of his ordeal occurred. Dr. Chen theorized, before Kasai could fully return to his pride, he had to reclaim his throne, and that meant multiple battles with the males who had taken control during his absence. The evidence for these battles was written across his scarred body, the claw marks that suggested repeated combat, the broken ribs that indicated being slammed and thrown repeatedly, the internal injuries that suggested a creature being beaten down repeatedly, and yet rising to fight again. Thomas, the ranger who had discovered the skeleton, continued investigating northward. By January 2020, he had pieced together a more complete picture. He found evidence of at least 7 separate lion kills scattered across the northern territories. 7 dead lions, all bearing evidence of violent combat, all theoretically dating from the period of Kasai's wandering. Thomas couldn't prove that Kasai had killed all of them, but the pattern of violence, the locations, and the timeline all suggested that Kasai hadn't simply been fleeing during those 14 months. He had been fighting constantly. He had been killing to survive, killing to establish himself in unfamiliar territories, killing to reclaim his way home. He was a warrior, Dr. Chen said in an interview with a wildlife documentary crew in early 2020. Kasai wasn't just fighting to survive, he was fighting to exist. During those 14 months, he was engaged in combat with lions, hunted by humans, pursued by dogs, driven into territories where he had no advantage. And yet he kept going, he kept fighting, he kept moving forward. By the time he returned to his territory, he wasn't the same lion who had left. He had been forged in violence. He had been tempered by suffering. He had become something harder, something colder, something more dangerous. The physical evidence supported this interpretation. When researchers compared Kasai's behavior before his disappearance to his behavior after his return, the difference was stark. Before, he had been a competent ruler, confident and capable. After, he was something more primal. His hunting became more aggressive. His territorial claims became more violent. His interactions with other lions became increasingly brutal. In December 2019, Kasai encountered a young male from a neighboring pride near a waterhole. The confrontation lasted less than 2 minutes. The young male, who by all accounts was a healthy and capable fighter, was killed. But it wasn't a quick kill. Rangers found evidence that Kasai had wounded him, driven him, pursued him, and finished him with overwhelming force. The body showed claw marks and bite wounds that far exceeded what would have been necessary to simply defeat a rival. It suggested anger, suggested a need to completely and utterly dominate, suggested the mindset of a creature who had learned that mercy was death. In the months that followed his return, Kasai's legend began to grow in different ways. The guides and rangers who worked in the reserve started to speak of him differently. He was no longer the great king. He was the returned warrior. He was the lion who could not die. He was the beast reborn. The stories grew darker. Tourists who asked to see him were warned to stay away. He was considered too unpredictable, too dangerous, too likely to attack anything that approached. But the lionesses of his pride seemed to understand something that the humans didn't. They didn't fear him, they recognized him, and more than that, they seemed to respect what he had become. When Kasai returned to his pride in full, the lionesses welcomed him not as a mate or a protector, but as something more fundamental, as a force that would ensure their survival, regardless of the cost. By February 2020, it became clear that Kasai's presence was reshaping the entire territorial dynamics of the region. Other prides were abandoning waterholes, where he was known to hunt. Males who had previously been aggressive and territorial were retreating when his roar echoed across the plains. The very mention of his name seemed to strike something primal in the other lions, a recognition that they were facing a creature that had been tested in ways they could never understand. Dr. Chen published her findings in a comprehensive research paper titled The Return of Kasai, Territorial Recovery and Behavioral Transformation Following Extended Absence in an African Lion Population. The paper detailed his scars, his injuries, his hunting patterns, and his territorial expansion. But more than that, it attempted to address the deeper question of what the 14 months away had done to his psychology. Kasai represents a unique case of survival and recovery in wild lion populations, Chen wrote in the conclusion. His physical transformation, while remarkable, is perhaps less significant than his psychological transformation. This lion has experienced trauma that would have been fatal to most individuals. Yet not only did he survive, he has returned more dominant, more aggressive, and more capable than before. The question this raises is profound. What is the nature of trauma and survival in wild animals? Does suffering create wisdom, or does it create only harder, colder, more dangerous versions of what came before? The answer, based on Kasai's behavior in the months and years following his return, seemed clear. Suffering had not created wisdom in him. It had created something colder, something more dangerous, something that was, in many ways, more successful at surviving and dominating, but at the cost of everything that might be considered compassionate or merciful. Yet the lionesses stayed with him. The cubs born to his pride during those months carried his genetics, his blood, his capacity for both dominance and brutality. And across the delta, other lions learned to fear his roar, to respect his territory, and to understand that in the hierarchy of predators there was one lion that stood above all others, not because he was the largest or the strongest, though he was certainly both, but because he had been broken and had refused to stay broken. He had been destroyed and had rebuilt himself into something harder, colder, more dangerous than he had ever been before. This was the transformation that occurred during those 14 months away. This was what had happened to the lion they thought was dead. He had gone into the wilderness as a great king. He had returned as something far more dangerous. He had returned as a legend written not in triumph, but in scars. And the savannah would never forget what survival had cost him, or what it had made him become. The legacy of Kasai's return would reshape not just the territory he controlled, but the very understanding of how wildlife researchers conceptualize trauma, survival, and transformation in wild animals. By 2021, 2 years after his mysterious reappearance, the data collected on his behavior had become the subject of international conferences, academic papers, and heated debates among the world's leading primatologists and wildlife behaviorists. But the most profound impact was something that couldn't be quantified in a research paper or presented in a PowerPoint slide. It was a fundamental shift in how the rangers and guides who worked in the Delta thought about the creatures they studied. The territorial expansion Kasai achieved in the year following his return was unprecedented. By mid-2020, he controlled approximately 220 square kilometers of prime savanna, nearly triple the size of his original territory. This expansion hadn't occurred through peaceful negotiations or gradual boundary shifts. It had occurred through a series of violent confrontations that left dead lions scattered across the landscape like grim monuments to his dominance. In March 2020, Kasai encountered a coalition of 4 young males who had begun to establish themselves in the eastern territories. The confrontation occurred near the Sara marshlands, and rangers who witnessed the aftermath described a scene of carnage that suggested the battle had been absolutely brutal. 2 of the 4 males were killed. The other 2 limped away, bearing wounds so severe that one died from infection within a week. The surviving male was never seen in the territory again, apparently having fled to neighboring regions and never returned. In June 2020, Kasai killed the dominant male of the neighboring Okavango pride in a battle that lasted nearly 40 minutes. The fight was so violent that it was heard from kilometers away, the roars and snarls echoing across the plains like the sounds of some ancient warfare. When it was over, the Okavango pride's territory began to integrate into Kasai's expanding domain. The lionesses and cubs of that pride didn't resist. They seemed to understand that resistance would mean death, and surrender meant survival. But the most shocking incident occurred in August 2020, when Kasai confronted an entire pride consisting of 3 adult males and 8 lionesses near the Galana River. Normally, a single lion, even one as formidable as Kasai, would be at a severe disadvantage facing such odds. Lions are social hunters. They use coordinated tactics. They rely on numbers. A single male, even a powerful one, should have been overwhelmed by superior numbers and tactical coordination. What happened instead defied conventional understanding of lion behavior. Kasai didn't engage in a traditional battle. Instead, he employed a strategy that suggested calculation and psychological warfare. He attacked the 3 males one at a time, systematically separating them from the safety of the larger group. He wounded the first male severely and drove him away from the others. Then he turned on the second, employing similar tactics, isolating and defeating him. By the time he confronted the 3rd male, the pride's cohesion had collapsed. The lionesses, seeing their protectors defeated one after another, began to retreat rather than fight. The 3rd male, facing Kasai alone, was killed in brutal fashion. The battle lasted less than 5 minutes, and suddenly Kasai was standing victorious, having single-handedly defeated the dominant males of an entire pride. The lionesses of the Okavango pride, now leaderless and vulnerable, submitted to his dominance. Within weeks, Kasai's territory had expanded again, now encompassing both his original domain and the prime hunting grounds of the Okavango pride. Dr. Chen documented this expansion with both scientific precision and growing concern. "What we are witnessing is unprecedented," she wrote in a field report dated August 2020. "A single lion has, through a combination of superior physical capability and what can only be described as tactical intelligence, consolidated control over nearly 300 square kilometers of territory. He has killed at least 12 adult males in the span of less than 18 months since his return. He has incorporated the lionesses and territories of at least 3 separate prides. What is emerging is not a pride structure as we traditionally understand it, but something closer to an empire." The impact on the wider lion population was dramatic. Other coalitions began to avoid the region entirely. Males who might have previously challenged for territory recognized the danger and sought safer lands. The population structure of the delta was shifting, with Kasai's dominance becoming so absolute that some researchers began to question whether he might eventually control the entire northern region. But as Kasai's territorial control expanded, something unexpected began to happen. His behavior, while still aggressive and dominant, began to show signs of a different kind of evolution. The blind rage that had characterized his initial return began to give way to something more calculated. He started to tolerate the presence of other young males in his territory, provided they remained submissive and didn't challenge his authority. He allowed them to hunt, to mate, to establish themselves as long as they acknowledged his dominance. This was a significant shift. It suggested that Kasai, despite his traumatic experiences and the hardness they had created, was capable of learning and adapting beyond pure aggression. He was beginning to understand that absolute conquest required more than violence. It required the cooperation of others. It required the ability to inspire loyalty through both fear and through the security of belonging to his domain. By late 2020, a new social structure had begun to emerge in Kasai's territory. Rather than a traditional pride with a single dominant male, what developed was something more complex. Kasai was the supreme authority, unchallenged and unchallenging. But beneath him, a hierarchy of younger males began to establish themselves, each understanding their place, each contributing to the collective hunting and protection of the territory. The lionesses, numbering nearly 30 across all the integrated prides, operated with remarkable coordination under Kasai's indirect guidance. The hunting success rate in Kasai's territory increased dramatically. Where individual prides had previously operated with success rates around 25 to 30%, the integrated population under Kasai's loosely coordinated system achieved success rates approaching 45%. This wasn't due to individual improvement in hunting technique. It was due to coordination, to timing, to the ability of multiple hunters to work together toward a single goal. Kasai, through his presence and his occasional direct participation in hunts, was creating an efficiency that transformed his territory into something close to an ideal predator habitat. Tourism in the reserve increased dramatically. As word spread about the legendary lion, guides could reliably take tourists into Kasai's territory and promise sightings of the largest, most scarred, most distinctive lion in the region. Hotels expanded, the reserve's revenue increased, conservation funding that had previously been uncertain became abundant. Paradoxically, the brutal, scarred warrior who had returned from the dead was now one of the primary economic drivers of conservation efforts in the region. But the transformation of Kasai went beyond territorial expansion and economic impact. It was also visible in the physical changes that continued to occur in his body. The scars from his ordeal didn't fade. Scars on big cats are permanent, but they began to be covered by new growth of mane as he aged, and his hormonal systems adjusted to his recovery. By late 2020, approximately 18 months after his return, Kasai's mane had filled out dramatically. The dark coloring that had been so striking upon his return began to be joined by golden undertones as the new growth came in. His appearance began to shift from that of a scarred survivor to that of a mature, powerful king in the prime of his dominance. Visitors to the reserve began to speak of Kasai in almost mythological terms. He was the lion who survived death. He was the warrior king. He was proof that nature could produce creatures capable of enduring horrors that would break ordinary beings. Social media was filled with photographs and videos of him, each image circulating widely, each telling the story of his scars and his dominance in ways that transcended the simple documentation of wildlife. Yet among the rangers and researchers who knew him best, there was a more nuanced understanding. Kasai was not simply a triumph of survival. He was also a cautionary tale. His story demonstrated what trauma, suffering, and violence could produce when combined with the physical capabilities and the instinctual drive of an apex predator. The Kasai that had returned was not better than the Kasai who had left. He was different. He was more dominant, more powerful, more capable of controlling territory, but he had lost something in the process. The intelligence that had once guided his dominance had been replaced by a colder, more aggressive calculation. The mercy that might have characterized his rule had been replaced by a willingness to use overwhelming violence whenever he perceived a challenge. Dr. Chen continued to track his behavior throughout 2021 and into 2022. She documented his interactions with his pride, his hunting patterns, his territorial patrols. She collected data on his offspring, tracking the cubs born to his lionesses to understand whether his genetic material and his behavioral influence would shape a new generation of lions capable of the same dominance he had achieved. What emerged from her research was a complex picture. Kasai's cubs, both male and female, showed remarkable development. The males displayed the same aggressive confidence that characterized their father. The females showed heightened intelligence and coordination in hunting. Some of his offspring seemed to inherit not just his physical capabilities, but also his tactical awareness. It was possible, Dr. Chen theorized, that Kasai was creating a new dynasty, one that would be shaped by his experiences, hardened by his influence, capable of maintaining dominance across generations. By 2023, 4 years after his mysterious return, Kasai had become a permanent fixture of the Delta's landscape. His territory was now recognized as one of the most productive hunting regions in the entire preserve. The lionesses under his dominion were healthier and more numerous than any comparable group. The cubs born in his territory had survival rates that exceeded averages across the region. In purely ecological terms, Kasai's presence was benefiting the lion population and the entire ecosystem dependent on its predatory role. But in 2023, something troubling began to occur. Rangers noticed that Kasai was moving less frequently. He spent more time resting, more time in the shade during the hottest parts of the day. His hunting participation became less consistent. The wound on his left side, the one that veterinarians had theorized involved his liver, began to show signs of complication. Kasai's left flank started to swell, suggesting possible internal infection or organ failure. The veterinary team requested permission to tranquilize him again to conduct an examination, but Dr. Chen declined. "He has suffered enough," she wrote in her field notes. "Whatever is happening internally, it is his burden to bear. We have examined him, studied him, documented him. To do it again would be to violate the covenant of observation without interference that we should maintain." By the beginning of 2024, Kasai was visibly declining. He was thinner, his movements were slower. The blind eye that had been so prominent in his appearance seemed to be sinking back into its socket as the tissue around it began to atrophy. Yet he continued to maintain his dominance. When younger males tested his authority, he responded with violence that was still devastating, even if it took him longer to achieve victory. On a morning in March 2024, rangers found Kasai resting beneath an acacia tree near the heart of his territory. His breathing was labored. Blood stained the ground beneath him, suggesting that the internal wound that had haunted him for 5 years had finally ruptured. He was dying. Everyone who saw him understood it. The great king was finally succumbing to the accumulated damage of his ordeal. But Kasai didn't die that day. He didn't die the next day either. He hung on for nearly 3 weeks, barely moving, barely eating, but refusing to surrender to death. The lionesses of his pride brought him kills. The younger males maintained the borders of his territory, and Kasai simply endured, lying in the shade, breathing heavily, waiting for the inevitable. On April 7, 2024, 5 years to the month after his mysterious return, Kasai died. He was found peacefully beneath the acacia tree, his massive frame finally still, his scarred face finally at rest. The rangers who discovered his body stood in silence for a long time, each understanding that they had witnessed the passage of something extraordinary. Dr. Chen arrived at the site in the early afternoon. She stood over his body for nearly an hour, not writing notes, not recording observations, simply looking at the lion who had captivated her research for 5 years. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet. "He survived the impossible," she said. "He endured horrors that would have destroyed ordinary creatures. He came back from what should have been death and rebuilt himself into something more powerful than what he had been before. But in doing so, he lost something. He became harder, colder, more dangerous. That's not a judgment. That's simply the truth of what survival costs sometimes." Kasai paid the price in pieces of himself that never healed. The necropsy conducted on his body revealed the extent of the damage his ordeal had caused. His liver was scarred almost beyond function. His lungs showed evidence of old pneumonia that had healed imperfectly. His bones, when examined, showed evidence of breaks and incomplete healing. Nearly every system in his body carried marks of the trauma he had endured. That he had survived at all was miraculous. That he had not just survived but thrived, dominating his territory and building an empire, seemed to defy all biological logic. Yet the legacy of Kasai extended far beyond his death. His offspring continued to rule portions of the territory. His influence shaped the behavior of generations of lions in the region. Researchers continued to study his case, continued to debate the implications of his story for understanding trauma, recovery, and transformation in wild animals. More than that, Kasai had become something beyond a single lion. He had become a symbol of the capacity for survival. Yes, but also a symbol of the cost of that survival. He was a reminder that nature is neither kind nor cruel. It simply is, and creatures within it adapt, survive, and sometimes transform into something unrecognizable in the process. His body was left where it fell, according to the traditions of the reserve. The scavengers came, the hyenas, the wild dogs, the vultures, the creatures that had once feared him, came to claim the remains of the mighty king. Within days, little remained except bones scattered across the earth. Within weeks, even those bones were scattered by weather and scavenging, becoming part of the dust and soil of the savanna he had once ruled. But in the collective memory of everyone who had encountered him, Kasai remained. He remained in the stories told by guides to tourists. He remained in the research papers and academic debates. He remained in the territory he had shaped and dominated. And most importantly, he remained in his offspring, in the lions who carried his blood and his genetics, and in some ineffable way his indomitable will to survive. The question that Dr. Chen had posed at the beginning of her research, what is the nature of trauma and survival in wild animals, remained ultimately unanswered. But Kasai had provided one possible answer. Sometimes, survival requires a fundamental transformation. Sometimes it requires the loss of everything soft and merciful. Sometimes it produces creatures that are harder, colder, more dangerous than they were before. Is that evolution? Is that adaptation? Is that triumph or tragedy? The savannah doesn't answer such questions. It simply continues, grinding forward with its endless cycles of life and death, predator and prey, dominance and submission, and somewhere in that vast landscape, new lions are being born. New battles are being fought. New legends are being forged in blood and scars, and the unbreakable will to survive. This is the story of Kasai, the lion that everyone thought was dead, the lion that returned unrecognizable, the lion that transformed trauma into dominance, suffering into power, and loss into an empire. His story will be told for generations, not because he was perfect or merciful or kind, but because he refused to stay dead, because he refused to surrender, because he proved that in the African wilderness, survival sometimes comes not through wisdom or compassion, but through a cold, relentless determination to endure, no matter the cost. If this incredible true story of survival and transformation amazed you, if it left you questioning what you know about animals and their capacity for resilience, please hit that subscribe button right now, turn on your notifications, share this story with someone who needs to hear about the power of refusing to surrender, about the transformative nature of survival, about what it truly means to be a warrior in the wild. Because stories like Kasai's are rare, stories of creatures that shouldn't survive but do. Stories of transformation that pushes the boundaries of what we thought was possible. And if you want to continue this journey into the untold stories of the African wilderness, into the legends and the myths that shape our understanding of nature's most magnificent creatures, then join us. Because there are always more stories to tell. There are always more legends waiting in the darkness of the savannah, and they deserve to be heard. Thank you for being here until the end. Thank you for witnessing the story of Kasai, the lion that death couldn't claim, the warrior that returned to reshape everything he touched. His legacy lives on, and his story will echo through the African plains for generations to come.